Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the Congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present moment of crisis. Their purpose is to offer members of our community, and all who wish to join us online, science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Pinn, the Angus Cullen Professor of Humanities and a Professor of Religion at Rice University. Dr. Pinn is the author of more than 35 books on humanism, hip-hop, religion, race, and politics. He's also the director of two centers at Rice, the Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. In addition, he's the director of research for the Institute for Humanist Studies at Washington, D.C., which is a think tank. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Dr. Pinn, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
I wonder if you could begin by telling us what humanism is.
Well, there are a variety of ways to understand and define humanism. For me, it is a philosophy of life that centers on human accountability and responsibility, takes seriously science, and exists without any sense of supernatural existence, no gods or gods, just humans trying to make their way through the world.
So it's a human-oriented philosophy that focuses on this world rather than whatever might exist outside of our present reality. And I'm wondering, I think, during this global pandemic, there are a lot of people asking the question, why is this happening? Some religious thinkers like to blame human suffering on human sinfulness and claim that episodes like this are a form of divine punishment. Others simply want to know where pain and suffering and perhaps greed and malice come from. In theological terms, this is sometimes called theodicy or the question of evil. And as a humanist, I'm wondering how you would have us think about evil.
Yeah. Outside of a science lab, I'm not quite convinced the why question concerning COVID-19 is very useful. That within the context of theistic thinking, this theodicy question is about attempting to find a justification, a reason for this misery. And if you look at the way this theodicy arguments have developed over the course of time, they have typically lodged themselves in a demonizing of already marginalized populations. If we look to recent conversations, there are some Christians who've understood COVID-19 as God's punishment upon the world. Why is the world being punished? Because it has been open to gay and lesbian ways of being in the world, right? So an already marginalized population is further demonized and marginalized. I just don't find that very productive. It seems to me, rather than asking that why question, the better approach is simply to wrestle with what we can do to alleviate misery within the current moment. So ethics over theodicy.
So in this sort of move from from theodicy to ethics, I guess I'm curious about what you see as the source of ethical action, right? Like, why should we engage in the struggle against misery? I mean, like, maybe so for COVID-19, maybe it's a little bit easier to see because it does actually impact everyone globally from a health perspective. But, I'm certainly fairly comfortable, and I think that that's true for a lot of members of my congregation. So why engage in ethical action and ethical struggle when, like, maybe you're fairly well insulated from some suffering or from some forms of injustice?
I think radical individualism has been toxic. That the better understanding, the better orientation is to recognize that we are individuals within the context of a collective, that we are a part of a larger web of life, and that our obligation isn't simply to ourselves or those we hold dear, but our obligation is to the well-being of this larger web of life. If we think that way, then this ethical obligation becomes much more robust, much more much more energetic. We have an obligation that extends, that is expansive, that moves beyond those who are like us or familiar to us, to a obligation to do something, to think and behave in ways that safeguard this larger arrangement of life.
So, yeah, I mean, I resonate with this idea that individualism is toxic. I mean, I think it's a very illusory idea that is really, at the heart of a lot of systems of oppression and problems that we have here in the United States and actually in the world. And I think it's a really important point to press upon. I mean, I gave my most recent sermon actually on this sort of very point, like that individualism is not what we need to be oriented towards right now. It's really sort of a sense of social salvation or social understanding of like where we're at, and that we need to actually work to improve the web, to improve everybody's well-being if we're going to get out of this situation in any real way. So I would like to take a moment to now turn the conversation to race, because you are one of the leading, or perhaps the leading, humanists who have argued that humanism must grapple with the question of race. So why do you think it's important for humanists to talk about race?
Well, to the extent humanism is concerned with the human on some level and concerned with the human within the context of a larger arrangement of life, I don't know how we do humanism well and not take seriously the modes of disregard that hamper quality of life. I don't know how we advocate for the basic principles of humanism and not take seriously the ways in which certain populations suffer because of anti-Black racism, homophobia, etc. That to do humanism and to ignore those, from my vantage point, is suspect.
So, essentially, your argument is basically to really authentically live out humanist principles, you have to grapple with questions of racial injustice.
I don't see how we concern ourselves with justice and with well-being. I don't see how we live out those humanist principles and not take seriously what is hampering life. It seems to me that that approach to humanism easily lends itself to a safeguarding of white supremacy and white privilege.
So I want to get to two words you just used there in a second, white supremacy and white privilege. But before we do that, I'm curious what you would think of people who would have us valorize folks like Thomas Jefferson, who are, held up very often both within the sort of humanist tradition and within the sort of Unitarian Universalist tradition as these great figures for liberty and for free thought. I mean, for instance, the Beacon Press, which is the Unitarian Universalist Association's major press, publishes the Jefferson Bible, which is, a collection of, basically he went through and excised out the miracles in the Gospels and the canonical Christian New Testament and reconstructed sort of his view of Jesus from that, which is very popular with many, Unitarian Universalists. And what would you have us do with a figure like Jefferson?
I think you're absolutely right. I don't know very many free thinkers or humanists who don't embrace Thomas Jefferson, and there's a problem in there. In embracing Thomas Jefferson, one links one's humanism to slavery and sexual violence. Now, I'd also say that it is perfectly acceptable to appreciate and to make use of the principles and the ideas of a figure without trying to render that figure perfect, right? So there are things we can appreciate about Thomas Jefferson and recognize that he was a racist and he committed sexual violence. What it forces humanists and freethinkers to do is to wrestle with the ways in which disregard and violence have been a component of this philosophy of life. And if they are concerned with justice, it requires then turning attention to making a difference, not by trying to suggest they are outside of the confines of this nastiness, right? So some humanists will argue race isn't a biological category, it's a social construct, and so this really doesn't matter to us. Right? To move beyond that, recognize that this tradition has been flawed to the extent it has been linked to this sort of misery, and as an alternative, try to live out the best principles of this humanism, recognizing our shortcomings and trying to adjust for them.
So basically, it's you're suggesting anti-perfection, or a move against perfection, right? That there's something to be learned from somebody like Jefferson, flawed as he was, because people have flaws within them, and that we need to both acknowledge the flaws and recognize that there maybe are productive or valuable things that can be learned from somebody. So Jefferson's Bible, for instance, can be a useful tool for those of us who want to sort of think about how Jesus might be a useful religious teacher to turn to, while at the same time acknowledging that Jefferson himself was, well, purveyor of sexual violence, a slave master. We could go on from there. But
it's a maturing of our perspective to the extent we begin to recognize that the utility of a thinker's ideas is not premised upon the perfection of their personal life. Right? If perfection is the criterion, no one survives. Right? If perfection is the criterion we have to apply, then Martin Luther King Jr. doesn't survive. Right? So it's a recognition that we are flawed individuals, and rather than simply overlooking that or trying to bracket it, it's a matter of wrestling with it, recognizing it, seeing the impact it has had, and try to correct for that.
Right. I mean, I think that this is a question that I often struggle with or encounter when thinking about the arts in particular. I don't know why particularly the arts, maybe because I spend so much time thinking about the arts, but there are particular poets and painters who I am drawn to, who just frankly were not very nice human beings. I mean, Ezra Pound was basically a fascist. I mean, was a fascist. And yet, I think is an incredible poet and purveyor of particular, I've just learned an enormous amount from him over the years. Or one might think of like Francis Bacon, who there's a fantastic exhibit at the MFAH, if it ever reopens, who like...
Right.
Was not, as far as I can tell from his biography, a particularly nice person, but he was an incredible painter. And the emotional resonance that I get from looking and engaging with his work is just profound.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And one of my favorite writers is Richard Wright, and he was not a really nice guy.
Yeah.
Right. So we can use these ideas, but using these ideas doesn't require us to bracket or ignore the ways in which these figures bought into a problematic system. Right. On some level, that kind of effort to use the ideas and be aware of the downside, aware of the ways in which these figures participated in injustice, holds us accountable and responsible, right? It provides an opportunity for us to wrestle with ourselves. What are the ways in which I participate in this system I critique?
Yeah, I think that actually is a great bridge to sort of thinking about two words phrases, I guess, that you used a moment ago. So you used the phrase white supremacy and you used the phrase white privilege, right? And so, I've been trying to push the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston to engage in more racial justice work and to be more intentional about trying to foster itself as a multiracial community. We're in one of the United States' most diverse cities, and the congregation is like about 84% white at this point. So I've been trying to lift up. Let's think about white supremacy. Let's think about white privilege. Let's think about what these words mean and how we can deal with being in a racially unjust system. And not surprisingly, I've had some people who've been uncomfortable with those terms and have said that they're not productive. They don't find them useful analytics or useful ways of engaging with their lives and with the world. And I'm wondering if you could reflect for a little while about why you find those two terms, white supremacy and white privilege, to be particularly useful.
Well, because they are truthful terms. They tell us something about the nature of life within the context of the United States. And I'd say that the discomfort isn't something that should be ignored or avoided, but there's something productive in that discomfort. It recognizes the ways in which we occupy time and space and the kind of troubled and troubling nature of that occupation of time and space. I don't know how we make gains. I don't know how we struggle against injustice if the criterion is comfort. What we end up with is more shades of the same.
So you think that they're essential ways of thinking about where we're at because they're just truthful descriptions of our society.
It's the nature of life in the United States. So I'll give you an example. A commonly used phrase is people of color. And you'll have folks across the spectrum in the United States making use of this phrase, people of color. But what does it do? It tends to hide white Americans. This category is everyone except for white Americans, that they are, if you use this phrase, the only ones who are not raced. And we know that this is fundamentally flawed, that race has tainted and affected every single community. But this phrase, people of color, implies that whiteness is normative. There's whiteness in everything else.
You would say, or you would remind us, I guess, that race is a social construct. It's something that is constructed, and whiteness is something that is constructed and is being constructed.
Oh, sure. I mean, you don't have whiteness, for example, without blackness, right? It needs the counterpoint.
So I think within that, I'd like to kind of turn the conversation on race a little bit to the question of cultural appropriation, because I think that like this idea of whiteness is kind of the assumed, the disappeared. I mean, because like one of the things I think using the term white supremacy does is, or white privilege is, it sort of brings into the conversation things that are kind of disappeared from the conversation, like the idea that that whiteness has a culture to it. The whiteness is a culture. I mean, or cultures really, because like as a Yankee in the South, I have to say that like the culture, there are cultural differences between like New England and Houston, Texas, or Michigan and Houston, Texas. But that, one thing I see a lot of times is this sort of like attempt to, run away from whiteness or turn away from whiteness by adopting or appropriating aspects of other cultures. So turning to, Native American or Indian, or I mean, really like almost any culture other than kind of white culture for inspiration and and for using it in different ways. So I wonder if you could help us think about this question of cultural appropriation for a moment.
Yeah, from my vantage point, cultural appropriation is another marker of white privilege, the assumption that if it exists, it is there for my benefit and I can use it freely. And the problem with that is it ignores, if not actively denounces, the origin of that cultural production. It assumes that it has no life, has no value, has no importance until whites appreciate it. Right? It kind of wipes out the origin. It wipes out the communities that have fostered these developments and, in a sense, dehumanizes these communities that have developed these cultural productions. And that is fundamentally problematic. Now, there's another side to this. It seems to me it is perfectly reasonable to assume that folks will make use of and appreciate cultural production that extends beyond their immediate community. But the key is this: to do that in a way that recognizes the source, that celebrates the source, and that doesn't detangle this production from the source. So, for example, hip-hop culture. I'm a fan of hip-hop. And hip-hop is global. There are ways in which it belongs to no particular group. at this point. It is a global phenomenon that has affected how we think, how we behave. Our aesthetic has been influenced by it. And so I would expect that there are white Americans who make use of this, and that's perfectly fine. The problem is when their use, their adoption of hip hop wipes out its historical ties to Black and brown young folks. Then it's problematic. It has wiped out populations. And in this way, it is another marker of white supremacy, of white privilege. It exists. It's for my benefit. It has no value until I make use of it.
Yeah, I think that almost the key or the core of what you're talking about is the question of relationship, or the question of, what is your relationship to another culture, or to a culture that you maybe are not at the center of. I mean, I think hip hop is a great example of it. I mean, I'm maybe a little less of the hip hop generation, more of the like house and techno generation, which I think is more of a geographic accident than like any particular aesthetic affinity, because I just grew up in Michigan, and then in the Midwest in the in the 90s when house and techno were very much kind of like the urban music that one listened to, right? I mean, like that was what was being played in the clubs that I would go to, and the parties that I would go to as a I guess I want to say a kid, I don't know, a teenager in my early 20s. And then later in DC being exposed to go-go music, which, is and I think that it's about, for me, it was about relationship. Like, here I am, these are all primarily, at the time at least, African-American forms of music. And that, I was exposed to them and engaged in them, and then had a continuing relationship with a lot of the artists who made them. I mean, I feel obliged here to just sort of mention the death of Mike Huckabee, who was a house musician who I knew since the early 90s in Michigan, who just died this week at the end of last week of COVID-19. And I think that this question of relationship and accountability really sort of speaks to humanism. Like, if I were to do things, in the past you sort of talked about the misappropriation of whites in the use of the N-word in hip-hop, right? And so if I were to do something that was sort of like a misdeployment or misappropriation of kinds of music culture that I engaged in or was engaged in, I certainly would be called on the carpet, so to speak, by people that I was in relationship with, or am in relationship with, with friends of mine. And I think that in terms of the question of cultural appropriation is a really key thing. Like, by whose authority, or what is your relationship with this thing? Is it something that's a kind of free-floating abstract thing out there which you're going to be entitled to and claim as kind of in some way, or is it something that you have a genuine engagement with, that you're sort of accountable to, part of the community in some way?
Yeah. I mean, another element, another toxic element of this appropriation is that the community of origin is reduced to its labor, right? Not its creativity, it's reduced to its labor. And it has value only to the extent its labor has produced something that is now enjoyed by a white population. In this way, taking hip hop, for example, it reduces these artists, again, to their labor, and in this way is akin to the system of indentured servitude, of Jim and Jane Crow, and of slavery, that this population is only of value to the extent its labor produces something we can enjoy.
I think that that's a really important way of thinking about this, and I would love to sort of dig more into this, but we have limited time, and I really want to sort of move on to us thinking about the racial dimensions of the coronavirus pandemic. So I wonder if you could offer up your thoughts about race and COVID-19 right now.
Yeah, it seems to me that people of African descent in the United States have disproportionately suffered in terms of contact with COVID-19 and death. And it seems to me that this is an opportunity to look at the nature of racial disregard within the United States. And I think that requires more than the initial, somewhat superficial move we tend to make. That is to say that lots of folks will say, yes, African Americans are dying from this, but underlying conditions, it's diabetes, it's high blood pressure, it's heart disease, without getting at the fundamental cause of that, racism, anti-Black racism, right? So this is an opportunity to push beyond the surface, to go deeper, to drill down, and to recognize the wide-ranging ways in which anti-Black racism affects life in the United States, the ways in which it is literally death dealing.
So within sort of religious discourse, particularly within the biblical traditions, there's this idea of apocalypticism, which is the kind of tearing away of the veil or the exposing of things that are like unseen. And that the apocalyptic moment is this moment where things that had been hidden are revealed. And I have found it useful to think about sort of the pandemic as kind of an apocalyptic moment in that way, and that we see unveiled the structural racism that is part of this culture that we're in and is part of capitalism, and then the sort of raw exploitation of so-called essential workers, right, which in many cases seems to actually just be another way of saying expendable workers. I mean, if you think about, I interviewed a grocery worker the other day who, a couple weeks ago, who they were talking about how, here they were expected to work 60, 70 hours a week at great personal health risks, but we're not getting adequate protective equipment. We're not being really compensated appropriately for the work that they were doing to make the food chain, continue to function and getting the rest of us fed. So, what would you have us do with this kind of knowledge, I guess, that is now unavoidable for people to see? I mean, you even have like Anthony Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying on national television that like the increased death rate amongst African Americans is a result of like long-standing structural injustices of the public health system. So if humanism is a philosophy of action, we now cannot avoid the fact that so-called essential workers are actually expendable workers, something I think being made very clear today by the president's use of the Defense Production Act to force meatpacking workers to work. What should we do? So what are the actions that we should take? How should we think about action at this time?
The first thing, it seems to me, is a shift in posture. And by that, I mean a suspension of talk of future and a firm commitment to wrestling with the present. I'd also suggest that we move away from outcome-driven strategies, the assumption that good effort on our part will produce outcomes, and instead move again towards a preoccupation with the present. What are the ways in which we can say no to injustice on a fundamental level in the current moment, despite what that may or may not produce? What can we do within this moment to wrestle with the fundamental demise that we are encountering? And it seems to me we think that way, reposition ourselves, and then in terms of action, we act locally. What can we do within the context of our life arrangements to say no to this injustice, to alleviate some of the misery? One of the first things we can do is cover up, right? There's some basic things we can do. Cover up, put on a mask, take this thing seriously, and think about our movement through public spaces in a way that doesn't center the self, but what might my presence mean for others, right? So a different orientation. What does my activity mean for others?
I really like that, because that breaks us out of the sort of individualistic framework that I think is so unhelpful. And that the truth is that it's, I think, only by asking that question, what does my activity mean for others, that we will emerge or mitigate this crisis that we're in right now. Because it is ultimately actions around social distancing and covering up that are, frankly, individual actions in this that will help us so much, dealing with it. I mean, on the other hand, you also have the sort of what I would say mass societal failure at the moment to really deal with this on things that go beyond individual actions, right? So, the contact tracing is like an essential part of, if we're going to reopen society, tool that needs to be used, and yet, there is no state other than, I think, 3 states, Michigan and maybe 2 rural states, are hiring enough contract tracers to engage in, that process. So I think that there is also a need for collective action to put massive pressure on the state and federal officials to take this seriously and to center, well, frankly, to center life, which I, at this time. So this question of sort of future-oriented activity takes us to, I think, the question of hope, which is something you and I have publicly discussed, in the past, and I think we'll probably publicly discuss again. We've had, I think, some pretty productive conversations about that, because it's a point of disagreement between the two of us. And I would like to hear you offer up kind of your thoughts on, like, is hope a useful framework for us to be using right now? And if so, what we should be hoping for at this time?
Yeah, I don't find the category of hope particularly useful. It projects a future and privileges outcomes. Instead of that, rather than hope, I would privilege and celebrate persistence, right? A persistent struggle, a sustained and loud no to injustice. Folks working on that in local and global contexts in ways that make sense to them, but premised upon a collective no to injustice. I find lots of inspiration for this in the figure Albert Camus, particularly his take on the myth of Sisyphus. For him, Sisyphus isn't broken by this requirement to roll this rock without rest, without end, but he gains a certain type of lucidity, a certain type of awareness of his position in the world, an awareness of circumstances, and in that is the victory. And so again, rather than this sense of hope, I would call for persistent effort in the moment that recognizes, as Camus says concerning Sisyphus, happiness is found in the effort. One must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Well, I would love to talk about hope more and get into this at great depth. So maybe we can have you back in a few months, and you and I can just have a rousing conversation on why I think hope is a little bit more useful than you do, and why you think that I'm kind of crazy for thinking that. So, in the meantime, I'd like to just thank you so much for being with us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you when it's safe for us to all be back together.
That sounds good.
In Houston. And I'd like to thank all of our members and viewers for tuning in. I hope that you'll join. There's that word, hope, right? Please join us next week when we will be talking with Aisha Hauser, President-elect of the Liberal Religious Educators Association, about faith formation during this pandemic. If you found this video to be helpful, consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. This week I'll be preaching a sermon on persistence titled, How Can I Keep From Singing? It will include readings, prayers, and music by our award-winning music director, Mark Vogel. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was filmed and produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as it's possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.